I liked Maureen's use of that net analogy. What I'm going to talk about is the categories that would allow you to get in line, sometimes very quickly, sometimes over many years, to become a resident of the United States in most cases, although I'll mention some temporary categories. But even if you get into one of those lines, whether it's an immediate one to marriage to a U.S. citizen spouse, or whether it's waiting through your brother or sister for 11 years in line, at the end, the net is there. And the net used to prevent someone who was in line, was at the top of the line and ready to become a resident, either here or applying at an American embassy, from using that application, that support process, the sponsorship process to get here. The waiver would then sort of open a little hole in the net. So the great news is that that waiver for HIV was terrible. It was really an anti-gay waiver when it first came up, although I must say I also had a terrible case of a nun from an African country who was a group of 6 sisters that were attacked and raped during the Civil War there. One was killed, the rest fled to Great Britain and the United States. They all tested positively for HIV. Well, she's a celibate Catholic nun with no spouse, parent, or child who was a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, so she was ineligible for the waiver of HIV status. So the bigots in Congress who passed the law to go after gay men in the 80s and the 90s really used it in such a big way that it affected a lot of other people who really weren't gay either. And unfortunately, there's been this huge change, and I'll even give the former President Bush support in this, because this amendment of the act was passed in his period in 2008. But there was this change where people started to realize that they didn't have to be afraid of HIV, and that the public policy had been opposed by the Secretaries of Health and by the Surgeon Generals, and that politically now they weren't going to pay a price for coming up with a better health policy. So we're at that point now where that net no longer blocks people at the end of the categories that I'm going to sort of describe for you, okay? So the Immigration and Nationality Act is the law that rules here, and also the U.S. Constitution to some extent. The world is in this category, in these categories, are divided into U.S. citizens and aliens, foreign nationals. U.S. citizens are anybody born in the United States, whatever their parent status is, except for the children of active diplomats from other countries. So we have the law of the land as the principal rule. It is not by blood alone, it's by the law of the land. If a person is born inside the United States, they are a U.S. citizen by birth. If they're born outside the United States, they may still be a U.S. citizen depending upon their parents' nationality. And it's a sort of a tortured area of law that has changed multiple times during much of the last century and even into this century, so that you could get benefits sometimes through your parents, sometimes only through your mother, sometimes only through your father. Sometimes it depended upon whether they were married, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it depended upon how long they had been in the United States. And so it's not as simple a rule. The rule of blood that was through the mother or father is actually a more convoluted rule if you're born outside the United States. But a number of people are citizens when born outside the United States of one or both U.S. citizen parents. And then the other big group is the one that Maureen ended with, that is naturalized U.S. citizens, people who have become permanent residents and then after a period of 3 to 5 years apply for naturalization, and when they're granted that, they are a U.S. citizen by naturalization. The rest of the world, the foreign nationals, divided into these categories. The lawful permanent residents, and I'm going to go into those categories in some more detail, and that's where the HIV medical exam would come up, is in the application for permanent resident status, either here or an immigrant visa abroad. Non-immigrants, persons temporarily coming to the U.S., and there are, I think 40 or 50 of those categories at this point. Persons admitted as refugees, asylees, or persons with temporary protected status. Refugee, asylee, basically people either outside the U.S., if refugee, inside asylee, who have suffered persecution or who have a reasonable fear of persecution, and I'll describe that a little bit further. Or temporary protected status given for temporary periods of time by senior government officials when something happens in the home country and the U.S. doesn't want to forcibly return people there. It could be a volcanic eruption, it could be a civil war, it could be an outbreak of some type of disease, but for some reason, politically, the government decides not to send people home. And then last, there's persons present without lawful status, broken evenly in some ways to groups of people who entered illegally. They never had a visa. They entered without inspection, or they were caught trying to come in. From the moment they step foot in the U.S., they're here illegally. The other group is people who came in with a valid visa and then broke the status of that visa in some fashion. They stayed too long. They did something that someone in that category couldn't do, like they were a student and they worked without permission, or they did something, they stopped doing something. They were a student and they stopped going to school. So persons either entered illegally or entered legally and then became illegal, and that's the last category. That's the one that people keep referring to as 12 million people. Just as a side note, the numbers are inherently unreliable. When we had the amnesty in the 80s, just before it passed in a big political compromise, which brought up employer sanctions and the I-9 form and now e-verification, if you've been reading about that, just before that passed, the ones who were opposed to the amnesty started using figures in the teens of millions. But prior to that, they had always said there were 5 or 6 million illegals. So here they're saying 12 million. Again, you can't prove that high or low. But just before they move to a vote, you can be virtually certain they'll start using figures of 19 to 20 million. And it'll be used politically to try to either support or defeat the amnesty.